Patricia nodded but didn't smile. An apology was a start, but it wouldn't undo the humiliation she had endured or restore her destroyed hairstyle. "Sergeant Kelly, I appreciate your apology, but this situation is far beyond what can be fixed with words. Your officers committed serious crimes tonight, and I intend to pursue every available legal remedy." Kelly nodded grimly. "I understand completely, ma'am. You have every right to file complaints and pursue legal action. In fact, I would recommend that you do so." He shot another angry look at his three officers. This kind of misconduct cannot go unpunished. As Patricia prepared to leave the scene, she realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. The three officers who had humiliated her were about to learn that actions have consequences, and that those consequences could extend far beyond anything they had ever imagined. The woman they had treated as a suspect was about to become their biggest nightmare. "Patricia, thank God," came General Morrison's familiar voice through the speaker. "I've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. We have a situation developing in Eastern Europe that requires your immediate expertise. I need you to get to the base tonight for a classified briefing." Patricia glanced at the three officers, who were now standing awkwardly around her car like children caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing. "I'll be there as soon as possible, General. There's been a slight complication, but I should be able to make it within the hour." "What kind of complication?" General Morrison's voice sharpened with concern. "Are you all right? You sound stressed." Patricia looked down at her ruined hair, then at the officers who had spent the last hour treating her like a criminal. "I'll explain when I see you, sir. But yes, I'm all right. Just dealing with some local law enforcement issues." "Local law enforcement?" The general's voice took on a dangerous edge that Patricia recognized from his dealings with incompetent contractors and bureaucrats. "What kind of issues?" "I'd prefer to discuss it in person, sir," Patricia said diplomatically. She could have explained everything right then and there, with the three officers listening to every word, but her military training had taught her the value of controlling information flow. "All right," General Morrison said after a pause. "But Patricia, if someone has interfered with one of my officers in the performance of her duties, I want to know about it immediately." "You understand me?" "Perfectly, sir," Patricia replied. "I'll see you shortly." She ended the call and looked at the three officers, who were now staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to dawning horror. The reality of what they had done was starting to sink in, and Patricia could practically see the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how to fix a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. The woman they had humiliated and degraded wasn't just some random citizen they could push around and forget about. She was a decorated military officer with direct access to some of the most powerful people in the government, and they had just given her a very compelling reason to use those connections. The silence that followed Patricia's phone conversation with General Morrison was deafening. The three officers stood frozen in the grocery store parking lot, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that they had made a terrible mistake. The confident swagger they had displayed throughout the encounter had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Rodriguez was the first to move. He rushed over to where Patricia's braids were scattered across the asphalt and began frantically gathering them up, as if somehow collecting the severed hair could undo what they had done. His hands shook as he picked up each braid, and Patricia noticed that he was breathing heavily. "Like someone who had just run a marathon. Colonel Williams," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry. We didn't know. I mean, we should have looked more carefully at your military ID. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding." He held the handful of braids out toward her, as if offering them back would somehow make everything right again. Patricia looked at the ruined hair in his hands and felt a wave of disgust wash over her. Those braids had been part of her professional appearance, something she had taken pride in maintaining throughout her military career. Now they were nothing more than discarded pieces of hair that would never be the same again. "A misunderstanding?" Patricia repeated, her voice carrying 20 years of military authority. "Officer Rodriguez, you stopped me without cause, searched my vehicle without permission, and physically assaulted me by cutting my hair. What part of that was a misunderstanding?" Thompson stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Ma'am, we were just doing our job. Someone called in a report about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. And when we saw you driving slowly through the area, he trailed off, probably realizing how weak his excuse sounded even to his own ears. What suspicious activity? Patricia demanded. Driving carefully through a residential neighborhood? Following traffic laws? Being a black woman in an expensive area? Her voice was still controlled, but there was fire in her eyes that made all three officers take a step backward. Martinez tried to join the damage control effort. Colonel, we're really sorry about your hair. Maybe we can pay for you to get it fixed, or... He stopped talking when he saw the look Patricia gave him. The idea that they could somehow pay their way out of what they had done was so insulting that Patricia couldn't even find words to respond. Rodriguez was still holding the severed braids, looking around desperately as if he could find some magical solution to their problem. Other shoppers continued to move through the parking lot, and Patricia noticed that several people were openly staring now. Some were taking pictures with their phones, probably posting on social media about the strange scene they were witnessing. "Put those down," Patricia said quietly, gesturing toward the braids in Rodriguez's hands. "You've done enough damage." Her tone was the same one she used when dealing with soldiers who had made serious mistakes during training exercises. It was calm but carried the weight of absolute authority. Rodriguez dropped the braids as if they had burned him. They scattered across the pavement again, creating an even more pitiful sight than before. Patricia pulled out her own phone and began taking pictures of the scene. The scattered hair, the three ashamed officers, her damaged appearance reflected in her car's windows. "Colonel, please don't do anything hasty," Thompson pleaded. "We can work this out between us. No need to involve anyone else." The desperation in his voice was obvious to everyone present. He was a veteran officer who had probably never faced consequences for his actions before, and the possibility of real accountability clearly terrified him. Patricia looked up from her phone's camera. "Work this out between us? Officer Thompson, you just committed a federal crime. You violated my civil rights under color of law, which is a felony offense. Did you think I would just go home and pretend this never happened?" The word felony hit the three officers like a physical blow. Martinez actually stumbled backward, his face going white. Rodriguez started pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair in agitation. Thompson just stood there, looking stunned, as if he couldn't believe that his actions might have real consequences. Patricia continued taking pictures, documenting everything she could think of. She photographed the officers' badge numbers, their patrol car license plates, the location of the incident, and the timestamp on her phone. Her military training had taught her the importance of thorough documentation, especially when dealing with potential legal issues. "Ma'am, please," Rodriguez said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I have a family, kids. I can't lose my job over this." The irony wasn't lost on Patricia, that he was now appealing to her humanity after spending an hour, treating her as if she had none. "You should have thought about your family before you decided to assault a citizen," Patricia replied coldly. "You should have considered the consequences before you ignored my military ID and treated me like a criminal." She finished taking photos and put her phone back in her purse. A fourth patrol car pulled into the parking lot, this one with sergeant stripes on the side. Patricia watched as a heavy-set man in his 50s got out and surveyed the scene with obvious confusion. This had to be their supervisor, probably called in because the situation had gone on longer than expected. Sergeant Kelly walked over to the group, his eyes taking in the scattered braids on the ground, Patricia's disheveled appearance, and the three officers who looked like they wanted to disappear into the pavement. "What's going on here?" Kelly asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with difficult situations for many years. "Rodriguez, why are you not in your patrol car? And what's all this mess on the ground?" Rodriguez tried to speak but couldn't seem to find his voice. Martinez stepped forward instead. "Sergeant, we had a situation with a suspicious person, and things got a little complicated." He was clearly trying to downplay what had happened, hoping his supervisor wouldn't dig too deeply into the details. Patricia decided it was time to take control of the conversation. She stepped forward and extended her hand to Sergeant Kelly in a firm military handshake. "Sergeant, I'm Colonel Patricia Williams, United States Army. Your officer stopped me for allegedly driving suspiciously through the Maplewood Heights neighborhood. During their subsequent illegal search of my person, they physically assaulted me by cutting my hair without cause or justification." Kelly's eyes widened as he processed what Patricia had just told him. He looked down at the braids scattered on the ground, then back at Patricia's damaged hairstyle, then at his 3 officers who were all staring at their feet. "They cut your hair?" Kelly asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why would they cut your hair?" "They claimed they were searching for contraband hidden in my braids," Patricia explained. "Despite the fact that I showed them my military ID and told them repeatedly that I am a decorated Army officer. They chose to ignore my credentials and treat me like a criminal." Kelly turned to face his officers, and Patricia could see the anger building in his expression. "Is this true?" he demanded. "Did you 3 actually cut this woman's hair during a traffic stop?" Thompson tried to defend their actions. "Sarge, we had reasonable suspicion that she might be hiding something. We've had training about people concealing items in their hair, and her hairstyle was—" He stopped talking when he saw the look of horror spreading across Kelly's face. "You cut a military officer's hair because you thought her braids looked suspicious?" Kelly's voice was rising now, and Patricia could tell that he understood the magnitude of what his officers had done. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've brought down on this department?" Rodriguez found his voice again. "We didn't know she was really a colonel. We thought maybe the ID was fake or something." His excuse sounded pathetic even to him, and he seemed to realize it as soon as the words left his mouth. "Her military ID was fake?" Kelly repeated incredulously. "Did you run it through the system? Did you call the base to verify her identity? Did you do any actual police work, or did you just decide to assault a citizen based on your personal prejudices?" The 3 officers remained silent, unable to defend their actions in the face of their supervisor's questions. Patricia watched the exchange with grim satisfaction. Finally, someone in law enforcement was taking her situation seriously. Kelly turned back to Patricia with an expression of deep embarrassment. "Colonel Williams, on behalf of this department, I want to apologize for what happened here tonight. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable, and I promise you that there will be consequences for these officers' actions." Patricia stood in the parking lot with her destroyed braids clutched in her hands, trying to process what had just happened to her. The 3 officers seemed satisfied with their work, chatting casually among themselves as if they had just completed routine paperwork instead of violating a citizen's basic human dignity. The fluorescent lights from the grocery store cast harsh shadows across the scene, making everything feel surreal and nightmarish. Thompson was filling out some kind of report on his clipboard when Patricia's phone began to ring. The sound cut through the evening air like an alarm, loud and insistent. Patricia looked down at her phone, which was still in her car's cup holder where she had left it before the traffic stop began. The caller ID made her heart skip a beat. "Pentagon, General Morrison," flashed across the screen in bold white letters. Patricia's mind immediately shifted into military mode. General Morrison was her direct superior, a man she had worked with for over 5 years on some of the Army's most sensitive operations. He rarely called her personal phone, and never this late in the evening unless something urgent was happening. This could be about the deployment she was scheduled to lead next month, or the training program she was developing for new officers. The phone continued ringing, its electronic melody creating an odd soundtrack to the bizarre scene in the parking lot. Rodriguez glanced over at the sound but didn't seem particularly interested. To him, it was probably just another personal call that could wait until their investigation was complete. But Patricia knew better. When the Pentagon called at 8:30 in the evening, it meant something important was happening somewhere in the world, and they needed her expertise or leadership to handle it. She had received similar calls before deployments to Afghanistan, before humanitarian missions after natural disasters, and before classified operations that she still couldn't discuss publicly. The call went to voicemail, but almost immediately the phone started ringing again. Same caller ID, same urgent tone. Patricia realized that whatever was happening must be serious enough that General Morrison was calling repeatedly until he reached her. "Officers," Patricia said, her voice taking on the commanding tone she used when addressing subordinates in the military. I need to answer that call. It's from the Pentagon, and it's probably urgent military business. Martinez looked up from where he was continuing to search through her car's interior. You can make your phone calls after we're done here, he said dismissively. This is more important right now. The irony of a local police officer telling a military colonel that his fishing expedition through her car was more important. Then Pentagon business was not lost on Patricia. The phone rang a third time, then a fourth. Patricia could see the frustration building on General Morrison's face in her mind. He was not a patient man under the best circumstances, and when he needed to reach someone for military business, he expected immediate responses. Thompson finished writing something on his clipboard and walked back toward Patricia. We're going to need you to empty your pockets completely, he announced. Turn them inside out so we can see everything. This request was the final straw for Patricia's patience. But before she could respond, her phone rang again. This time, Rodriguez seemed annoyed by the persistent sound. He walked over to Patricia's car and looked at the phone screen, probably intending to silence it or turn it off entirely. But when he saw the caller ID, his expression changed slightly. Pentagon? He said, reading the display. What's the Pentagon calling you for? There was skepticism in his voice, as if he suspected this was somehow part of an elaborate deception on Patricia's part. Because I'm a colonel in the United States Army, Patricia replied, her patience finally wearing thin. I've been trying to tell you that since this whole thing started. That's why you have my military ID in your possession right now, along with my driver's license. Rodriguez looked down at the documents in his hand as if seeing them for the first time. He had been so focused on looking for reasons to doubt Patricia's identity that he had completely ignored the obvious evidence of her military service. The phone stopped ringing, but within seconds it started again. This time the caller ID showed a different number, but with the same Pentagon identifier. Patricia realized that General Morrison had probably asked his aide to try reaching her from a different line, thinking there might be a technical problem with the first call. Look, Patricia said, trying one more time to reach some reasonable part of these officers' minds. I understand you're doing your job, but I really need to take this call. It could be about national security matters that require immediate attention. Thompson laughed, a harsh sound that made Patricia's stomach turn. National security, he repeated mockingly. Right. And I suppose you're going to tell us you're some kind of war hero, too. The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Patricia looked directly at Thompson and spoke with quiet dignity. Actually, I am. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Congressional Medal of Honor. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. I've led soldiers in combat, coordinated relief efforts during disasters, and spent the last 20 years serving this country. Her voice never rose above a conversational level, but there was steel in it that hadn't been there before. The 3 officers exchanged glances, and for the first time since the encounter began, Patricia saw a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, but it was too little, too late. They had already committed to their course of action, and admitting they might have made a mistake would require a level of humility that none of them seemed to possess. The phone rang again, and this time Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to ignore it, he reached into Patricia's car and answered the call himself. Hello? Rodriguez said into the phone, his voice taking on an official tone. This is Officer Rodriguez with the City Police Department. We have your friend here in custody for questioning. Patricia couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see Rodriguez's face changing as whoever was on the other end of the line began to speak. His casual confidence started to fade, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like concern. Yes, sir, Rodriguez said after listening for a moment. She's right here. We stopped her for, suspicious activity in the Maplewood Heights area. There was another pause, longer this time, and Rodriguez's face grew pale. Colonel Williams? Rodriguez repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Yes, sir, she did show me a military ID, but we weren't sure. He trailed off, apparently being cut off by whoever was speaking to him. Patricia watched as the color drained completely from Rodriguez's face. Martinez and Thompson had stopped their search of her car and were now watching their colleague with growing alarm. Whatever was being said on the other end of that phone call was clearly not what any of them had expected to hear. "General Morrison," Rodriguez said, and Patricia saw him swallow hard. "Yes, sir, I understand. She's right here, sir, safe and sound." But his eyes darted to the scattered braids on the ground, and Patricia could see him realizing that safe and sound might not be an accurate description of her current condition. The conversation continued for another minute, with Rodriguez mostly listening and occasionally saying, "Yes, sir," or "I understand, sir." His posture had completely changed from the aggressive stance he had maintained throughout the encounter. Now he looked like a child being scolded by a parent. Finally, Rodriguez held the phone out toward Patricia. "He wants to speak with you," he said quietly. His hand was actually shaking as he offered her the device. Patricia took her phone back, noting that Rodriguez couldn't quite meet her eyes. "General Morrison," she said, her voice instantly taking on the professional tone she used for military communications. "I apologize for not answering earlier, sir. I was detained." It was a Tuesday evening in late September when Colonel Patricia Williams found herself driving through the quiet streets of Maplewood Heights, one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. The sun was setting behind the perfectly manicured lawns and million-dollar homes, casting long shadows across the tree-lined streets. Patricia had just finished a long day at her civilian consulting job, where she advised defense contractors on military logistics and operations. At 45 years old, Patricia had dedicated over 20 years of her life to serving her country. She had led soldiers through dangerous missions in Afghanistan, coordinated relief efforts during natural disasters, and trained countless young officers who now served in leadership positions around the world. But right now, she was just a tired woman looking forward to getting home to her quiet apartment and maybe catching up on some reading. Her car, a modest sedan that she had owned for 6 years, moved steadily through the residential streets. Patricia always drove carefully, especially in neighborhoods like this one where police presence was high and traffic violations were taken seriously. She kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, maintained the speed limit, and used her turn signals at every corner. It was second nature to her now, this careful way of moving through certain spaces. The braids in her hair were pulled back neatly, secured with a simple black elastic band. She had spent 3 hours at the salon just 2 weeks ago, getting them done perfectly. The braids weren't just a hairstyle choice for Patricia. They were practical for her military duties, professional enough for her civilian job, and a connection to her heritage that she cherished. Each braid was carefully sectioned and woven, representing hours of skilled work by her longtime stylist. Patricia was thinking about the presentation she needed to finish for tomorrow when she noticed the police car in her rearview mirror. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police cars were common in this area, and she was driving legally with valid registration and insurance. But as she made a right turn onto Elm Street, the police car followed. Then another right turn and another. The squad car stayed behind her, matching her speed and her route. Her heart began to beat a little faster. Patricia had been in this situation before, more times than she cared to count. She knew the routine by now. She pulled into the parking lot of a well-lit grocery store and put her car in park, then placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel where they could be seen. She took a deep breath and waited. Officer Rodriguez stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward her vehicle. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with the confident stride of someone who had been on the force for a few years, but still felt the need to prove himself. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, a detail that Patricia noticed immediately. In her military training, she had learned to assess situations quickly and notice small details that could become important. Patricia rolled down her window as the officer approached. She kept her voice calm and professional, the same tone she used when addressing her subordinates in the Army. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" "License and registration," Rodriguez said without returning the greeting. His eyes scanned the interior of her car, looking for something, though Patricia couldn't imagine what. Her car was clean and organized, with only a few work files in the back seat and a gym bag in the trunk. Patricia reached slowly for her purse, announcing each movement as she had been taught in the countless training sessions she had attended about police encounters. "I'm reaching for my purse now to get my license and registration." She pulled out her wallet and carefully extracted her driver's license. From the glove compartment, she retrieved her registration and insurance papers, but Patricia also pulled out her military identification card. This wasn't just any ID card. It clearly stated her rank as colonel, her years of service, and included her photograph in military dress uniform. She handed all the documents to Officer Rodriguez together, hoping that her military credentials would help establish her character and background. Rodriguez took the documents but barely glanced at the military ID. He studied her driver's license with intense focus, comparing the photograph to Patricia's face multiple times. "This address is pretty far from here," he said, referring to her home address on the license. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" "I work nearby," Patricia explained patiently. "I was driving home from my office." She didn't mention that her consulting work involved classified defense projects or that she held top-secret security clearance. She had learned over the years that too much information sometimes made situations more complicated rather than less. The officer continued to study her documents, paying particular attention to her driver's license. "This picture doesn't really look like you," he said finally. Patricia knew this was untrue. The photograph had been taken just 18 months ago when she renewed her license, and she looked virtually the same now as she did then. Her appearance had been consistent for years, the same confident expression, the same careful way of presenting herself to the world. "I can assure you, officer, that's my current license," Patricia said. She was still being polite, still following all the rules she had learned about how to survive encounters like this one. "Keep your voice calm. Don't argue. Don't make sudden movements. Answer questions simply and directly." Rodriguez walked back to his patrol car, taking all of Patricia's documents with him. She watched in her mirrors as he sat in his car for several minutes, apparently running checks on her license and registration. Patricia knew her record was clean. She had never been arrested, had only received 2 speeding tickets in her entire life, and both of those had been over a decade ago. Her background checks for military security clearance were more thorough than anything the local police database could provide. While she waited, Patricia noticed other shoppers walking in and out of the grocery store. Several people glanced at the scene with curiosity, but no one seemed particularly concerned. This was just another routine traffic stop to them. They had no way of knowing that Patricia was a decorated military officer who had risked her life for her country, or that she was being treated with suspicion simply for driving through their neighborhood while being a black woman. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, Rodriguez returned to her car. But he wasn't alone. Patricia saw a second patrol car pulling into the parking lot, its lights flashing. Her stomach dropped. In all her years of military service, facing down armed enemies and life-threatening situations, Patricia had rarely felt the kind of anxiety that was building in her chest now. "Step out of the vehicle," Rodriguez commanded. His tone had changed. It was harder now, more aggressive. Patricia's military training kicked in again. She analyzed the situation quickly. 2 officers, both armed, both apparently viewing her as some kind of threat. Her best strategy was compliance and documentation. "May I ask why you need me to step out of the car?" Patricia asked. She was still being respectful, still following protocol, but she also knew her rights. A traffic stop shouldn't require her to exit the vehicle unless there was reasonable suspicion of a crime. "Just step out of the car," Rodriguez repeated. The second officer, whose name tag read Martinez, was now standing near the passenger side of her vehicle. Patricia realized she was outnumbered and in a situation that could escalate quickly if she didn't cooperate. Patricia opened her car door slowly and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. She was wearing simple business casual clothes, khaki pants and a blue blouse that she had worn to work that day. Nothing about her appearance suggested criminal activity or posed any threat to anyone, but she could see in the officers' faces that they had already decided she didn't belong in this neighborhood. What Patricia didn't know was that this was just the beginning of an encounter that would change her life and eventually make national headlines. She couldn't have predicted that in the next few minutes. These officers would make a decision so outrageous and unlawful that it would shock people across the country and lead to serious consequences for everyone involved, as she stood in that parking lot with her hands visible and her heart racing. Colonel Patricia Williams, Bronze Star recipient, Purple Heart honoree, and one of the Army's most respected officers, was about to experience something that would test every ounce of her strength, dignity, and faith in the system she had spent her life serving. Standing in the grocery store parking lot under the bright fluorescent lights, Patricia felt the cool evening air against her skin. She kept her hands where both officers could see them, a practice that had become automatic after years of navigating situations like this. The second officer, Martinez, circled around her car slowly, peering through the windows with exaggerated suspicion. "We need to search your vehicle," Rodriguez announced, pulling out a small notepad. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't explain what law she had broken or what they were looking for. It was simply a statement, delivered with the kind of authority that Patricia recognized from her military days, except this authority felt different. This felt personal. Patricia's mind raced through her constitutional rights. She knew that without probable cause or her consent, the officers had no legal right to search her vehicle. But she also knew that challenging them right now could make things much worse. Her military training had taught her to pick her battles carefully, and sometimes tactical retreat was the smartest strategy. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong," she said calmly. "I was simply driving home from work. Is there a specific reason you need to search my car?" She kept her voice level and professional, the same tone she used when dealing with difficult situations in the military. Martinez looked up from where he was examining her back window. "You were driving through this neighborhood pretty slowly," he said, "looking at houses, checking out the area. That's suspicious behavior." His accent suggested he was local, probably grew up in this city, but his attitude toward Patricia suggested he saw her as an outsider who didn't belong. Patricia almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Driving slowly and carefully was now suspicious? She had been taught to drive defensively in neighborhoods like this precisely to avoid attracting police attention. But apparently there was no right way for someone who looked like her to move through spaces like this. "I drive carefully everywhere," Patricia explained. "I wasn't looking at houses or checking out anything. I was just trying to get home safely." She thought about mentioning her military service again, but decided against it. These officers had already seen her military ID and seemed completely uninterested in her background or credentials. A third patrol car pulled into the parking lot, its lights adding to the growing spectacle. Patricia noticed that people coming and going from the grocery store were starting to stare. Some pulled out their phones, though whether to record or just to tell friends about the drama they were witnessing, she couldn't tell. She felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that she hadn't experienced since her early days in the military. Officer Thompson emerged from the third patrol car. He was older than the other two, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the confident walk of someone who had been doing this job for a long time. Patricia hoped that his experience might bring some wisdom to the situation, some perspective that would help de-escalate things. Instead, Thompson walked directly to Patricia and looked her up and down with obvious disapproval. His eyes lingered on her braided hair, and Patricia felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen that look before, in various contexts, throughout her life. It was the look that reduced her from a person with accomplishments and dignity to just another stereotype in someone's mind. "What do we have here?" Thompson asked Rodriguez, as if Patricia wasn't standing right in front of them. This was a tactic Patricia recognized from her military psychology training, dehumanizing someone by talking about them as if they weren't present. "Suspicious person driving through the Maplewood area," Rodriguez replied. "Claims she works around here, but something doesn't add up. We're doing a vehicle search." Again, they were talking about her, as if she couldn't hear them, as if her presence was irrelevant to their conversation. Thompson nodded and walked over to Patricia's car. He opened the driver's side door without, asking permission, and began looking through the interior. Patricia watched helplessly as he moved her work files around, opened her glove compartment, and examined her gym bag. Everything in her car was perfectly legal and ordinary, but he treated each item as if it might be evidence of some crime. "This hairstyle," Thompson said suddenly, turning to look at Patricia directly for the first time. "It's pretty elaborate. Lots of places to hide things." His comment hit Patricia like a physical blow. Her braids weren't elaborate. They were neat, professional, and practical. She had worn similar hairstyles throughout her military career without any issues from her commanding officers or colleagues. Martinez nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we've seen people hide drugs, weapons, all kinds of stuff in hair like that. It's a common tactic." Patricia realized with growing horror that they were serious. They genuinely believed that her natural hairstyle was somehow evidence of criminal intent. "Officers, my hair is just braided," Patricia said, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "There's nothing hidden in it. It's a normal hairstyle that millions of women wear every day." She wanted to tell them about the hours she had spent at the salon, about the skill and artistry that went into each braid, about the cultural significance of the style. But she could see in their faces that they had already made up their minds. Thompson reached into his patrol car and pulled out a small pair of scissors that officers sometimes carried for cutting seat belts or other emergency purposes. Patricia's heart began to race as she realized what he was planning to do. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to her, not after everything she had accomplished and sacrificed for her country. "We need to check," Thompson said matter-of-factly. "Can't be too careful these days." He approached Patricia with the scissors, and she instinctively stepped back. The movement caused all three officers to tense up, their hands moving toward their weapons. "Please don't move," Rodriguez commanded. "We're conducting a lawful search." Patricia knew this wasn't lawful at all, but she also knew that arguing would only make things worse. She was outnumbered, surrounded, and completely at their mercy. "This is not necessary," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm telling you there's nothing in my hair. I'm a United States Army colonel. I've served my country for over 20 years. Please don't do this." The desperation in her voice was something she hadn't heard since her worst days in combat zones overseas, but Thompson was already reaching for her braids. Patricia closed her eyes as she felt his rough hands grabbing sections of her carefully maintained hair. The scissors made a terrible sound as they cut through the braids that had taken hours to create and weeks to grow. Each snip felt like a piece of her dignity being stripped away. Other shoppers in the parking lot had stopped to watch. Some looked horrified, others seemed merely curious about the unusual scene. Patricia wished she could disappear, wished she could somehow transport herself back to her apartment where she could process what was happening to her in private. The braids fell to the ground around her feet, dark coils of hair scattered across the asphalt like fallen leaves. Thompson continued cutting, methodically destroying weeks of growth and professional styling. Patricia forced herself to stay still, knowing that any resistance would be used as justification for even worse treatment. "Nothing here," Martinez observed as Thompson finished his destructive work. Patricia's head felt strange and uneven, with patches of hair cut short and others left longer where the officer had been less thorough. She looked down at the braids on the ground and felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak that she couldn't fully express. The entire process had taken maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Patricia stood there with her ruined hair, surrounded by 3 officers who had just committed what she knew was a serious violation of her civil rights. They seemed almost disappointed that their search had turned up nothing, as if they had been expecting to find contraband hidden in her hairstyle. Thompson handed the scissors back to Rodriguez and brushed his hands off on his uniform, as if touching Patricia's hair had somehow contaminated him. "All clear," he announced, as if he had just completed some heroic act of law enforcement instead of humiliating an innocent woman. Patricia bent down and began collecting her braids from the ground. She wasn't sure why. They were ruined now, useless. But she couldn't bear to leave them scattered on the pavement like trash. As she gathered the remnants of her hairstyle, she noticed her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from a deep burning anger that she was struggling to control. The officers watched her collect her hair with apparent indifference. They had destroyed something that took time and money to create, something that was part of her identity and her professional appearance, and they seemed to view it as nothing more than a minor inconvenience in their investigation of a crime that had never occurred. As Patricia stood up with her ruined braids in her hands, she made a decision that would soon change everything. She was going to document this encounter. She was going to make sure people knew what had happened here. And she was going to use every resource at her disposal to ensure that these officers faced consequences for their actions. But first, she had to get through the rest of this encounter, and she could tell from the officers' body language that they weren't finished with her yet. 2 days after the incident in the grocery store parking lot, Patricia sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She stared at her laptop screen, watching the numbers climb steadily upward. Views, shares, comments, all growing by the minute as her story spread across the internet like wildfire. She had posted about her experience on social media the night it happened. After she returned home from her emergency briefing at the Pentagon, General Morrison had been furious when she told him what had occurred, and he had immediately connected her with the Army's legal department. But Patricia wanted to do more than just file official complaints. She wanted the world to know what had happened to her. The post was simple and direct. She had written it in the same clear, factual style she used for military reports. No dramatic language, no emotional appeals, just the facts of what 3 police officers had done to a decorated military veteran during a routine traffic stop. She included photos of herself before and after the incident, showing her neat professional braids and then her destroyed hairstyle. "Last night, I was stopped by police while driving home from work," the post began. "I showed them my military ID, which clearly identifies me as a colonel in the United States Army. Despite this, they chose to search my vehicle without cause and then cut off my hair, claiming they were looking for hidden contraband. I am a Bronze Star recipient, a Purple Heart honoree, and have served my country for over 20 years. But none of that mattered to these officers, who saw only my race and my gender." Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Patricia's friends and fellow service members were the first to spread it, expressing their outrage and disbelief at what had happened. Then it caught the attention of civilian supporters, civil rights organizations, and eventually major news outlets. Patricia's phone had been ringing constantly since yesterday morning. Reporters from newspapers, television stations, and online publications all wanted interviews. She had turned most of them down initially, still processing what had happened and trying to focus on her military duties. But as the story gained momentum, she realized that staying silent wouldn't make it go away. The first major news article appeared in the morning edition of the city's largest newspaper. The headline read, "Decorated Army Colonel Alleges Police Misconduct During Traffic Stop." The article included quotes from Patricia's social media post and background information about her military service record. It also included a statement from the police department saying they were investigating the allegations and taking the matter seriously. By noon, the story had been picked up by national news networks. Patricia watched herself being discussed on cable news shows, with commentators debating the incident and its implications. Some defended the officers, suggesting that Patricia might be exaggerating what happened. Others called for immediate arrests and federal intervention. The most powerful moment came when a major television network aired security footage from the grocery store parking lot. The footage was grainy and taken from a distance, but it clearly showed Patricia standing with her hands visible while Officer Thompson approached her with scissors. Viewers could see him cutting her braids and dropping them on the ground, could see Patricia picking up the scattered pieces of her hair. The video went viral within hours. Justice for Colonel Williams began trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of police misconduct and racial profiling. Veterans organizations issued statements of support. calling the incident a disgrace to everything our service members stand for. Patricia's story resonated particularly strongly with Black women, who shared their own experiences with discrimination based on their natural hairstyles. The incident sparked broader conversations about hair discrimination, racial profiling, and the treatment of women of color by law enforcement. The police department found itself under intense scrutiny as protesters began gathering outside their headquarters. The demonstrations started small, with maybe 50 people holding signs and chanting slogans. But as news coverage continued and more people learned about the incident, the crowds grew larger and more vocal. Patricia drove by the police station on her way to work the day after her story broke nationally. She was amazed to see hundreds of people marching in circles, carrying signs with her name and photograph. Some signs read, "Respect our veterans," while others focused on broader issues of police accountability and racial justice. The protesters were peaceful but persistent. They included veterans in uniform, local civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who had been outraged by Patricia's treatment. Local religious leaders held prayer vigils, while veteran groups organized honor guards to show their support for one of their own. Inside the police department, chaos was reportedly growing by the hour. Sources told reporters that Chief Davidson had called emergency meetings with his senior staff, trying to figure out how to respond to the crisis. The three officers involved in the incident, Rodriguez, Martinez, and Thompson, had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. The FBI announced that they were opening a federal civil rights investigation into the incident. This meant that Patricia's case would be handled not just as a local police matter, but as a potential violation of federal law. Civil rights violations committed by police officers carried serious criminal penalties, including possible prison time. Patricia received a call from a representative of the Department of Justice, informing her that they were treating her case as a high priority. The caller explained that attacks on military personnel by law enforcement officers were taken extremely seriously by federal authorities, especially when those attacks appeared to be motivated by racial bias. The three officers tried to defend themselves through their union representative, who issued a statement claiming they had followed proper procedures and that Patricia was mischaracterizing what had happened. The statement suggested that the haircutting had been a legitimate security measure and that Patricia was using her military status to gain sympathy. This defense backfired spectacularly. Veterans groups responded with outrage, pointing out that Patricia had earned her military status through years of distinguished service, including combat deployments and life-threatening missions. The suggestion that she was somehow exploiting her service record to gain attention was seen as deeply insulting by the military community. General Morrison gave an interview to a national news program, speaking publicly about Patricia's service record and character. "Colonel Williams is one of the finest officers I have ever had the privilege to serve with," he said. "She has risked her life for this country on multiple occasions, has led soldiers through some of the most dangerous situations imaginable, and has always conducted herself with honor and dignity. The treatment she received is not just an attack on her personally, it's an attack on everything the military stands for." The interview with General Morrison changed the entire tone of the media coverage. Previously, some outlets had treated the story as a typical police misconduct allegation, with the usual questions about whether the victim's account could be trusted. But when a respected military general vouched for Patricia's character and service record, even skeptical commentators began to take the allegations more seriously. Patricia found herself becoming a reluctant spokesperson for issues she had never planned to address publicly. She received invitations to speak at conferences, to write articles for major publications, and to testify before congressional committees. The incident had transformed her from a private military officer into a public figure, whether she wanted that role or not. The stress of the sudden attention was overwhelming at times. Patricia had spent her entire military career focused on getting the mission done, not on being in the spotlight. She was more comfortable leading soldiers in combat than she was giving interviews to reporters or speaking at rallies, but she also recognized that her platform came with responsibility. Her story had resonated with so many people because it represented something larger than just one traffic stop. It was about dignity, respect, and the basic human right to be treated fairly regardless of race or gender. As Patricia prepared for what she knew would be months of legal battles, investigations, and media attention, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. The three officers who had humiliated her in that parking lot had unknowingly created a national conversation about police accountability and civil rights. Their attempt to diminish her had instead amplified her voice in ways she never could have imagined. The fight for justice was just beginning, but Patricia was ready for the battle ahead. 6 months after that terrible night in the grocery store parking lot, Patricia stood in a federal courthouse wearing her full military dress uniform. The Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Congressional Medal of Honor gleamed on her chest as she prepared to watch justice finally be served. Her hair had grown back during the long months of legal proceedings, styled now in the same professional braids that had been so violently destroyed by 3 police officers who thought they could act without consequences. The courtroom was packed with supporters, reporters, and observers who had followed the case since it first made headlines. Patricia's fellow service members filled several rows, their uniforms creating a sea of military solidarity. Civil rights leaders, community activists, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by her story occupied every available seat. The message was clear. The country was watching. At the defendant's table sat officers Rodriguez, Martinez, and Thompson, looking nothing like the confident law enforcement officers who had humiliated Patricia months earlier. Rodriguez stared down at his hands, his face pale and drawn. Martinez fidgeted nervously with his tie, while Thompson maintained a stoic expression that fooled no one. Their careers were over, their reputations destroyed, and their freedom hung in the balance. The federal prosecutor, Attorney Janet Chen, had built an overwhelming case against the 3 men. Security footage, witness testimony, Patricia's detailed documentation, and expert analysis had painted a picture of clear civil rights violations committed under color of law. The evidence was so strong that the defense had tried multiple times to negotiate plea bargains, but Patricia had insisted on a full trial. She wanted the truth to be heard publicly. Judge Hamilton called the court to order and asked the defendants to stand for sentencing. The months of investigation had revealed a pattern of misconduct by all 3 officers, with the Patricia Williams incident being just the most serious example. Internal affairs records showed previous complaints about excessive force and discriminatory behavior that had been ignored by their supervisors. Officer Martinez, Judge Hamilton began, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. You have been found guilty of violating Colonel Williams' civil rights through the use of excessive force and conducting an illegal search based on racial bias. The evidence clearly shows that you participated willingly in cutting the hair of a decorated military veteran without legal justification. Martinez swallowed hard as the judge continued. This court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You are permanently barred from working in law enforcement in any capacity. The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the silence. Courtroom Officer Thompson received a harsher sentence, due to his role as the senior officer who had actually wielded the scissors. 24 months in federal prison, Judge Hamilton announced, followed by 3 years of probation. Your actions represented a particularly egregious abuse of power, made worse by your attempts to cover up what happened. Rodriguez, who had cooperated more fully with investigators and shown genuine remorse, received 12 months in prison and 18 months of probation. His cooperation had helped prosecutors understand the full scope of what happened that night, including the racist comments made by his colleagues that weren't captured on the security footage. Patricia watched the sentencing with mixed emotions. She felt satisfaction that justice was being served, but also sadness that it had taken such a public ordeal to achieve accountability. These men had families who would suffer because of their choices, children who would grow up knowing their fathers were in prison for committing hate crimes. After the sentencing, Patricia addressed the media outside the courthouse. Dozens of cameras and microphones surrounded her as she spoke about what the verdict meant to her personally and to the broader community. "Today's sentences send a clear message," Patricia said, her voice steady and strong. "No one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to uphold it. What happened to me was wrong, but it was also part of a larger pattern of discrimination that affects countless Americans every day." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "This case was never just about me. It was about the fundamental principle that all citizens deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, gender, or appearance." The legal victory was significant, but Patricia had already moved beyond seeking punishment for the officers. She had spent months working with lawmakers, police departments, and community organizations to push for reforms that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Her first major success came when the city passed the Colonel Williams Act, a local ordinance requiring mandatory bias training for all police officers and establishing strict protocols for conducting searches. The law specifically prohibited searches based solely on hairstyles or cultural appearance, and created an independent oversight board to investigate complaints of discriminatory policing. The legislation had been controversial initially, with the police union arguing that it would make officers' jobs more difficult. But public support for the reforms was overwhelming, especially after Patricia testified before the city council about her experience. Her military credentials and calm, professional demeanor made her an effective advocate for change. "I'm not asking for special treatment because I'm a veteran," she had told the council members. "I'm asking for the same basic respect and constitutional protections that should be available to every citizen. If this can happen to a decorated military officer, imagine how vulnerable ordinary citizens must feel." Patricia's influence extended far beyond her hometown. She was invited to testify before Congress about police reform and civil rights, where her military background gave her testimony unique weight with lawmakers from both political parties. Even representatives who were typically skeptical of police criticism listened carefully when a Medal of Honor recipient spoke about discrimination and abuse of power. The congressional hearing was broadcast nationally, and Patricia's testimony became a defining moment in the broader conversation about police accountability. She spoke not with anger or bitterness, but with the measured authority of someone who had dedicated her life to serving others and protecting American values. "The same Constitution I swore to defend in combat protects every citizen from unreasonable searches and discriminatory treatment," she told the congressional panel. "When police officers violate those constitutional rights, they're not just harming individual citizens. They're undermining the very principles that our military fights to defend." Overseas, her advocacy work led to invitations from police departments around the country who wanted her help, developing better training programs. Patricia found herself in the unusual position of working with the same type of officers who had mistreated her, helping them understand how unconscious bias could lead to serious violations of citizens' rights. The training sessions were sometimes uncomfortable, with officers initially defensive about being lectured by someone they had seen as their adversary. But Patricia's military bearing and obvious expertise gradually won them over. She didn't attack or blame them personally, but instead focused on practical strategies for improving community relations and avoiding the kind of mistakes that had destroyed 3 careers and traumatized a decorated veteran. One of the most meaningful moments came during a training session in Chicago, when a young black female officer approached Patricia afterward. "Thank you for fighting this battle," the officer said quietly. "I've experienced discrimination from colleagues who questioned whether I belonged in uniform. Seeing you stand up for your rights gives me courage to stand up for mine." Patricia realized then that her ordeal had created opportunities to help people she would never meet, in ways she couldn't have imagined when she was standing in that parking lot with her hair scattered on the ground. A year after the trial, Patricia received a promotion to Brigadier General, recognition of both her military excellence and her contributions to civil rights reform. The promotion ceremony was attended by many of the people who had supported her during the difficult months of legal proceedings, creating a celebration that felt like a victory for everyone who believed in justice and accountability. In her acceptance speech, Patricia reflected on the journey from that terrible night to this moment of triumph. "None of us can choose the challenges that life presents," she said, "but we can choose how we respond to those challenges. We can choose to let them break us, or we can choose to use them as opportunities to make the world a little better for the people who come after us." The three officers who had thought they could humiliate and degrade her were now in federal prison, their law enforcement careers permanently over. But Patricia had used their attack on her dignity to create lasting change that would protect future generations from similar treatment. Her story had become proof that even in America's darkest moments, when injustice seems to prevail, ordinary citizens armed with courage and determination can still force the system to bend toward justice. The woman who had been treated as a criminal for driving while Black had become a general, a reformer, and a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong.